Hi guys, my name is Michael Mwansaliova. I'm going to look at consideration for a takeover bid under corporate finance. This particular presentation covers the following. 1. I'll look at takeover bid using retained earnings. I'll look at takeover bid using cash borrowed with interest. I'll also look at takeover bid using a combination of cash and share exchange. In addition to this, I'll look at the two practical examples. One, where we'll investigate the effect of cash consideration for takeover on EPS, which is earnings per share. I also look at another example that will look at the effect of combination of shares and cash as consideration for takeover on EPS. Let me start looking at where the takeover bid uses retained earnings for consideration. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. Let me start with advantages. The first advantage is that you notice that there will be no additional debt incurred because you are using retained earnings, self-generated earnings. Secondly, the shareholders' equity remains unchanged. So in effect, there will be no dilution of share holding. There will be no dilution in this particular case. Okay, so those are the two advantages that you can benefit from using retained earnings as consideration for a takeover. The disadvantage, disadvantages as follows. I can think of one, that using retained earnings actually can lead to a limit in size of the acquisition to what the company can afford in the absence of external financing, because your resources now will be restricted to what you are able to generate as an entity. So you find that the size of acquisition is also scaled down to that particular limitation. The second disadvantage is that you might not be able or it might not be viable for a company which has retained earnings as the only means to use as consideration. Okay, so this might not be viable if a company has limited retained earnings, in short. So that is another disadvantage. The third one I can think of in this particular regard is that it might even take long to accumulate enough funds, and this can lead to delay in the acquisition. So these are some of the pros and cons of using retained earnings as consideration for a takeover. Let's look at the takeover where cash is borrowed, and this cash borrowed you have to pay back with interest. So what are the pros and cons as you are looking at a deal? If you are thinking about using borrowed cash to be used as consideration, look at these pros and cons. One of the pros is that it allows a company to make large acquisition that might not be possible with retained earnings, as earlier alluded to. That's the first advantage. I can also think of the next one in form of it can be faster way to execute the acquisition, because it's a matter of engaging somebody who is a financier or somebody who is able to advance you with this kind of money. You don't need to start looking around waiting for for time for you to generate that money. You just walk over to somebody who is able to finance and the deal is done. Okay, and then the third advantage is that this particular method of paying for the deal is found not to dilute existing shareholders' ownership. Okay, so the shareholders will enjoy the same rights and the same weight they will be throwing around in influencing the policy and other decisions of this particular entity. So there is no dilution in terms of shareholders' ownership. What of the disadvantages? Okay, one of the disadvantages that can fall under this particular way of closing a deal, meaning that you are paying cash which is borrowed as consideration. The first disadvantage I can think of is that one, the interest expense can have a significant impact on the company's profitability, and then you've got cash flow. Okay, will be shown to be maybe having an effect in terms of it being reduced. Okay, so meaning that the operational activities might be affected because you might not have sufficient cash which is ready and adequate to meet operational needs because of this particular transaction. We also have the second one, which can be explained as where you have high debt levels. Okay, high debt levels can increase financial risk, and this can negatively affect the company's credit ratings. Okay, so that is expected when the company is doing badly and you have high debt levels. You might be having challenges to meet them, and that can affect your credit ratings. Okay, so when you look at the ratio analysis or the analysis of the particular entity's financial statements, these debts can affect your ratings. Okay, so we also have the other one in terms of a disadvantage. We can think of as if the acquisition does not generate expected retained earnings. Again, in the same line, servicing of debt can prove to be a challenge, and then this can be leading to what I've just said before, that the credit rating can fall. Okay, so that is about the second method of consideration for a takeover bid. Now let's look at the third one, which is takeover bid using a combination of cash and share exchange. Now under this, again, I can look at a few pros and cons. To start with the pros, the first one I can talk about is that you find that it allows for flexibility in structuring the deal by both cash and shares. Okay, so that's what is good about this combination. The third pro is that you find that if the acquiring company shares are overvalued, okay, using them in the deal can actually be advantageous. Okay, the shares are overvalued, using them in the deal can actually be advantageous for obvious reasons. Okay, then also thirdly, I can say that shares can be useful currency for future acquisition. Okay, so that's what can be said about the advantages accruing to an entity that is using a combination of cash and share exchange as consideration for a takeover bid. Now let's look at the downside of it. Okay, the disadvantages can be as follows. Where you are using share exchange, that can first would lead to dilution of ownership for existing shareholders. The shareholders might resent that particular move because it will reduce their authority or their powers. Okay, there will be more interest group coming on board and to take part of their power. So that leads to dilution of ownership. Okay, so also the next one is that the stock portion of the deal is subject to market fluctuation. You know very well that if you are looking at the market price of shares, they might keep on fluctuating on the market. Okay, so that can affect this particular entity. Okay, the third one is that it may be challenging to negotiate a mutually actually agreeable exchange ratio, okay, with the target company. Okay, so there is a lot of subjectivity which might come in when it comes to ascertaining the value of shares in this particular regard. Okay, so it might be leading to a prolonged or protracted negotiation over the establishment of the mutually agreed exchange ratio with the target company. So that's what can be said about the three methods which is used as a consideration for takeover bid. Okay, one is using retained earnings. Second is using cash borrowed with interest. Third is using a combination of cash and share exchange. Having looked at that, I'm interested to look at what effect, how is the earnings per share affected if cash is used as consideration in a takeover bid. To help us, or to help me explain this, I'll use a practical example. So please follow through what I'm going to tell you or what I'm going to explain in this particular presentation. To start with, let's look at this particular scenario where, as I've said, cash is being used as a takeover consideration. So suppose that Eva PLC borrows $468,000 in cash at an interest rate of 12%. Okay, at an interest rate of 12%, to acquire Never Limited, and given that there is no additional equity to be used as consideration, you are further advised that earnings before interest and taxes after takeover amount to $300,000. Let me say dollars here. $300,000. Look at this. $300,000. Okay, so it's a matter of dollars. I'm using dollars. So $300,000 is what is the earnings before interest and taxes. Okay, and the corporation tax rate is 30%. Then I'm asking you to assume the EPS before takeover to be 5.6 cents. Okay, that's what we have. Okay, then what are we required to do? We are required to determine the earnings per share after takeover bid. Okay, so we're going to see how this is going to affect the earnings per share after the takeover bid. So before the takeover bid, it is given as that much. After the takeover bid, let's see what happens. Okay, so now to work out this one, take you to the next slide. As given here from the income statement, earnings before interest and taxes is given as $300,000. This is what we have got here, $300,000. Okay, then what are we using? We are using borrowed funds. We are borrowing $468,000 at an interest rate of 12%. Okay, so 12%. So what we have, so meaning that we are going to suffer an interest expense of 12% of $468,000, which will be $56,160 in the income statement. So meaning that the earnings after interest before taxes will now reduce to $243,840. Okay, so that's what we have. Then if we calculate the 30% as corporation tax, we are going to have that is the calculations. I think I've done this No, I didn't do that. So which is 30%. What is happening here is we're looking at 30%, which is the same as 0.3. Okay, 0.3 multiplied by the 243, 840. Okay, that is what going to give you a figure of $73,152. Okay, that's what you're going to get as corporation tax. So as tax expense further reduces your earnings to arrive at earnings after interest and taxes of $170,688. So that's what we have. Now, having done that, we look at further calculation to help us compute the earnings per share. So the earnings, total earnings we are given is 170,688. And how many shares? I hope I did indicate. Okay. Okay, just in this particular regard, this company, just a missing link, missing data. Let me just include. I assume that the number of shares was 3 million. Okay, number of shares was 3 million, and EPS before takeover that much. So that's the missing link, missing part to just complete this cycle. So meaning that if I have earnings of $170,688 and the shares are 3 million, then the EPS is supposed to be 0.05689 per share, which is simply 5.69 cents per share. That's earnings per share. So that's what we have in this particular computation. Okay, so we move on to look at this. That is what we have got. So we can compare. Before takeover, the EPS was 5.6. After takeover, the EPS is 5.69. There is a small increase of 0.09 cents. Okay, it has increased. There is an increase by 0.09 cents. So that's what you have observed. Okay. So now we look at the next situation in a similar manner. The next situation here we are looking at suppose we are using cash and shares as takeover consideration. Cash and shares as takeover consideration. Remember that in the first case we just use cash. So there was no further issue of shares. So the same 3 million shares were the ones which were at the end or after the takeover. Okay. So now in this particular second situation, the difference is a bit, the situation is a bit different. Why? Because as the situation is, we are told that never PLC borrowed, okay, 234,000 in cash at 12% interest, which is used to buy Ever Limited shares together with 234,000 worth of shares, which involve the issue of 450,000 shares valued at 52 cents each. Okay, so that's what the difference is. Now, as before, my assumption is, let's say we are still having the shares before takeover of 3 million. Okay, the share before takeover of 3 million. Just maybe to make clarification, let me insert this one, the shareholding before takeover is 3 million, just like before. 3 million. Okay, and then the total purchase consideration in this particular case is 468,000. Okay, price, and paid half in cash, that is 234,000, and the other half in shares worth 234,000 by issuing 450,000 shares. Okay, so I hope you have followed me. Assume EPS before takeover is 5.6 cents. Given that the consolidated income statement based on this proposal showed earnings before interest and taxes of $300,000 and corporate tax rate of 30%, find earnings per share after the takeover. So the situation here is we are using a combination of cash and shares. We are using a combination of cash and shares. So let's see how it plays out. Okay, we'll go look at the computation of earnings after interest and taxes. Maybe I can say before here, computation, and to just get this one. Okay, slap it here. Okay, that's just to give it a title here so that we know what we are working at. Okay, fine. So we have the earnings before interest and taxes as before. There is $300,000. Now here we have partially used cash which was borrowed, that is on the value of $234,000 at the rate of 12%. So that will give us an interest of 28,080 interest expense. That will bring down our earnings by that much, so that earnings after interest but before taxes will now be $271,920. Then that is subjected to corporation tax of 30%. So 30% as before, 30%, which is 0.3 times what are we looking at? 271,920. That is a calculation to give us 81,576. That's what is obtaining as corporation tax. So that will bring down our earnings further, so that we arrive at earnings after interest and taxes at an amount of $190,344. So once we have worked out this one, we go look at the earnings per share. Okay, now remember that we have just calculated the earnings after interest and taxes of $193.44. Fair enough, that's what we have here. So, but the shareholding has increased because there was a share issue of 450,000, meaning that you have a total now of shares increasing to 3,450,000. 3,450,000. That's what we have. Okay, 3,450,000. When you do the maths there, you are going to find that it will give you 0.05517 dollars, which is 5.52 cents. Okay, so that's what we have. So what have we seen? If we take the option of combining cash and share issue, the EPS will be slightly above the one previous, which is it slightly above or slightly below? The EPS was 5.0. Okay, slightly below, which is given as 5.52 as opposed to previous 5.6. Okay, and then the one where you don't use borrowing, the EPS is slightly above by 0.09. Okay, so that's what has happened here. Okay, that's what has happened here. So what have we seen? The interest expense. Okay, the interest expense has worked against us in terms of it has actually increased or reduced our earnings. Then also, because you have brought in more shares, there is dilution of EPS. So dilution of EPS. So the value might go down a bit because the figure is the drop in the last case. If you look at the last case, the drop is quite slight. Maybe the shareholders might not bother so much. But if the drop is too much, that can raise eyebrows by the shareholders because that debt has led to a marked difference in EPS. Has it diluted the EPS? So those are the things that you should look at when you are striking a deal when it comes to takeover bid. When it comes to using debt financing, such effects are felt on the EPS. Such effects are felt on the EPS. But if you don't use the debt, again, as I talked about the advantage and disadvantage, it might delay the acquisition and even the size of the acquisition, because maybe the retained earnings are not enough to acquire the size of or to make it possible for the acquisition size you are desirous about. So you might go for a debt financing. But as you look at the cash financing and debt financing, you have to look at striking a balance between the two, which is the optimum or which one is the best. Again, if you are the finance director involved in this particular situation, look at the shareholders. What are their best interests? Do you need to consider their interests? Are you going to injure their feelings? Okay, how sensitive are they to this type of changes? So those are some of the things as the finance director should be looking at when you're concluding such deals. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed my presentation. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like my videos. I'll be giving you more in corporate finance on various topics. Thank you for listening.